Hi, everyone, and welcome. I'm Caroline Jones, art historian in the History, Theory, and Criticism section of the Department of Architecture at MIT, and I'm director of the Transmedia Storytelling Initiative. I want to thank you all for coming to this virtual event, Data Magic and Democracy, which will frame questions about data privacy, about politics, and cinematic forms of transmedia storytelling. On behalf of MIT, which began as a land-grant university, I want to take a moment to acknowledge Indigenous peoples as the traditional stewards of that land. Just a few weeks ago, MIT chose to celebrate Indigenous peoples rather than the colonizer Columbus, so change is coming. It's fitting that I share with you that the land the Institute occupies is the traditional unceded territory of the Wampanoag Nation. Our valued Native American students and alumni have helped us acknowledge the painful histories of genocide and forced occupation of their territory, and we honor and respect the many diverse Indigenous people connected to this land on which we virtually gather. This evening's event may seem to be floating in the internet, particularly with this background that Paloma cooked up for us, but I can assure you that the benefits of occupying land of the Massachusetts peoples has made tonight possible. I'm grateful for that possibility, and I welcome those members of our Native American community who might be here with us tonight. Here's how I hope the evening will unfold. First, I'll briefly introduce the panelists. Then I'll offer a framing of the ways that contemporary films have framed the abstract entities we think of as data. And then I want to open the conversation among the panelists. Please scroll down on the interface that you're using, whether it's Facebook or the webcast, and you'll see a place to enter your questions. We'll hope to include as many of those questions and comments as we can later in the program. So the Q&A will be fielded on some of the very same platforms we're interrogating tonight, Facebook chief among them. And I think there's something incredibly bizarre and ironic about the fact that Facebook shut down the Transmedia Storytelling account about a week before this event. We haven't had time to do the forensics. We were told there's absolutely no appeal to this action. Your posting did not meet community standards, so we're done. So we're using Architecture's Facebook account to stream the event, and maybe there'll be time to figure out why Facebook hates us. In any case, our own involvement in the problems that we're talking about is happening in real time. We're on these platforms, drawing us together across research groups and even entire schools at MIT. The Transmedia Storytelling Initiative that I direct was funded a little over a year ago by David and Nina Fialco, who saw the possibilities of our shared imagining around what MIT could offer the future of narrative forms. I want to thank them for their conviction that documentary and expanded cinema and transmedia storytelling, combined with searching public discussions, can profoundly change culture in what we hope are progressive directions. On behalf of the Transmedia Initiative, then, I want to take a moment to thank a few other folks who are helping tonight. First, my colleagues in architecture, grad student producers Aidan Flynn, Paloma Gonzalez Rojas, and communications director Amanda Moore. They will be harvesting and consolidating your questions and comments and getting them to me in the chat of the panelists' Zoom windows. So collaborations like this involve many schools at MIT, and the Transmedia Storytelling Initiative is particularly indebted to our cross-posting friends at Comparative Media Studies in the School of Humanities, Arts, and Social Sciences and the Cross-Institute Center for Art, Science, and Technology. I, of course, have to thank my dean, Hashim Sarkis, and the School of Architecture and Planning that is the ultimate bureaucratic host of the Transmedia Storytelling Initiative. So I want to also finally thank MIT's media and video production team for making these combined interfaces work as an online event. Now, let's briefly spotlight our panelists that you'll be hearing from later so that you can recognize them and direct questions to them in the chats and question areas of these various interfaces. So first, I want the spotlight to turn to Ethan Zuckerman. Ethan was the first colleague I contacted for this program when we were planning it over a year ago. I was asking Ethan, how could we engage with the issues that were being raised by a spate of recent films on WikiLeaks, data harvesting, social media, Cambridge Analytica. When he was still at MIT, Ethan's work in the Center for Civic Media was centrally focused on the commerce and politics of these online platforms. He's now continuing his work as the director of the Institute for Digital Public Infrastructure at UMass Amherst, and is in full demand for his views on our virtual civic space. Apparently he's on leave at Columbia and was on a panel there even Thursday night. I was excited when Ethan suggested that we talk to our panelist tonight, Daniel Weitzner, who directs MIT's Internet Policy Research Initiative and is a research scientist at our Computer Science and Artificial Intelligence lab called CSAIL. Danny served in the former administration, the Obama administration, as the Deputy Chief Technology Officer at a very different White House than we now have, and also has experience as a policy director for the World Wide Web Consortium. In all these capacities, Danny has worked tirelessly to ensure privacy protections in our digitally connected world. Finally, I'm very pleased to introduce Patricia Williams, who recently moved from being a professor at Columbia's Law School to become Northeastern University's Director of Law, Technology, and Ethics Initiatives. A MacArthur Award winner in 2000, Pat is one of the foundational thinkers who has established critical race theory as both method and field in our universities. The author of the book Alchemy of Race and Rights. She is also an amazingly prolific public intellectual, addressing legal bias in sentencing algorithms, for example, in a spate of journals from the Daily Beast to The Nation, where she has a column, a beloved column, I might add, called The Diary of a Mad Law Professor. What a privilege it is and a treat to have these folks with us for the discussion later on, which will be in about 11 minutes from now. I want to share my screen so that I can show you a little PowerPoint I've produced to talk about what I mean by data magic. So let me do that. Screen sharing magic. I need the MVP folks to let me share my screen so I can show my PowerPoint. Can you guys do that? Great. Here we go. So what do I mean by data magic? We're trying to get to the full presentation. There you go. So here I'm just going to turn to one of MIT's great authorities, the science fiction writer, Arthur C. Clarke, who points out that any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. And this was one of the opening quotations in the new Netflix release, The Social Dilemma, which we'll be talking about a little bit later. These advanced technologies include everything from electricity to cinema to the computer you have either in your hand or on your desk. We want very much for you, our audience, to be part of this discussion. So another form of the magic allows you to add questions and comments to the variety of platforms on which the event is streaming. So if you're watching the webcast, go below and find the spot to enter your questions, and they will be seen. So the kind of cinema magic I want to talk about tonight includes mainstream fiction and documentary films, one of the main conduits for bringing controversial and inconvenient realities into public conversation. Our decision to host tonight's event began over a year ago, prompted by the then recently released Netflix production, The Great Hack, which interrogated the Cambridge Analytica scandal and pushed us to think broadly about the future of data privacy and the way we communicate issues about tech and society in popular cinematic forms. MIT's Transmedia Storytelling Initiative is particularly interested in taking the measure of such contemporary media and the stories it tells. The Great Hack sets up my framing inquiry here. How is the intentionally abstract concept of data figured in cinematic form? You can already get an idea here from the poster. The question demands, though, that we ignore the film's well-drawn main characters, such as David Carroll, the valiant professor who sues Cambridge Analytica to find out exactly what of his Facebook data the company acquired, Instead, we want to attend to the swirl of rectangular bits coming out of his ear. The directors Jahan Najayam and Karim Amr added these in post-production. This visualization is what I want to think about as data magic. It's as if we had special electromagnetically sensitized glasses on, allowing us to see computer bits being hoisted from Carol's cell phone, hovering around his ear briefly before being sucked into the cloud for data profiling by the putative political consultants. I'm clearly not the only one that found these special effects striking. They feature prominently in Netflix's promotional material, highlighted and exaggerated in a rave review about the film written by the online journal Digital Spy. Notice how the journal illustrator no longer imagines Carol exuding the data from an intact body. Rather, the professor is virtually obliterated by data's colorful, yet still grid-like, i.e. logically ordered, storms. The flesh-like aspect of Carol's data, when we get a close-up, implies that maybe it emanates from his actual person, right? So the contrast would be between these kind of psychedelically colored bits of data and this fleshy data closer to his body. So does it come from his person, from his device, from his environment? In the Digital Spy review, it's clearly an entirely synthetic or even psychedelic swarm that the journal wants to emphasize. So I want to speed through a recent history of such cinematic data magic to explore these tropes. As our poster design for tonight's event suggests, the 1999 Wachowski brothers classic, The Matrix, with its IBM monitor-colored phosphors raining down, set a certain catchy standard for how we might imagine a world saturated by code. And probably any of the MIT students watching this really had no monitors like this in their entire life. But the older members of the panel remember these monitors. Learning that the movie's famous digital rain was based on production designer Simon Whiteley's borrowing of his wife's Japanese sushi cookbook is just the proof we need that the content of any code as information is cinematically irrelevant, much less its political valence. Like this looping GIF pattern that I found using the search terms data flow and borrowed from my background tonight, the deep desire here is to visualize code as pure flow, analogous to the language of cinema itself, and as mesmerizing as a fireplace or a waterfall in nature. In this way, cinema is both echoing those forms of nature and becomes part of the post-war techno-scientific path charted by information theory's favorite conceptual hieroglyph, Claude Shannon's 1949 diagram for Bell Labs, that undergirds much of the computer revolution we've been living since then. The matrix and data flow GIFs figure data as a Bell system type linear linguistic signal, now multiplied in wireless, ready-made for cinematic flow. As my students know, I always love a good historical periodization argument. So here's my 10-second historical thesis. In US films of the aughts, data is a mysterious suffusing essence at environmental scale. So think The Matrix. In the teens, data flows from our assembled human institutions that magician renegades such as Edward Snowden or Julian Assange can collect and release at will. Approaching the turn to the 20s, data begins to emerge as a personal emanation from our bodies and devices, an intimate exhalation, capacitating an algorithmic puppetry that manipulates our drives, desires, and political will. How is this shift manifested in the films of these decades? In quick succession, Neo's vertical reign of code becomes the horizontal data constituting the real-life Edward Snowden in Laura Poitras's stirring 2014 documentary, Citizen4. And at almost the same moment, a fictionalized Julian Assange loses himself in a horizontal data environment in the 2013 DreamWorks thriller, The Fifth Estate. By contrast, the stills and posters from The Great Hack, made 6 years later, reveal that one of the film's central pivotal characters, former Cambridge Analytica business developer Brittany Kaiser, is neither made of data nor lost in it. Her image appears in it, haunting David Carroll, as in the poster for the film on the left, but she is left intact and unmuddied by data so that she can ponder the political effects of her own work, peddling Facebook data for pro-Brexit, pro-Trump political propaganda, a story that continues to unfold in the British legal system, I would suggest, rather more successfully than in our own. This begins to hint at the real politics of data magic, which rely on concealing the commerce in data harvesting and distribution. Who monetizes our clicks? Who profits? Who's listening? These are the tough political questions that I like to ask in my own scholarship. Questions recently sensationalized in the September 2020 Netflix release, The Social Dilemma. So, be scared, be really, really scared. Here, justifiable anxieties over political meddling have evolved into generalized terror about the destruction of human capacities for any kind of healthy social life whatsoever. Anxieties driven sky high by a global pandemic. As The Social Dilemma narrates, suicide rates among preteens and teens have shown a disturbing increase beginning in 2010, commensurate with the rise of social media. We know about the echo chambers that homophily algorithms have produced in our political culture, leading to instability at best and at worst, actual murders driven by conspiracy channels and racist digital rabbit holes. Yet I want to point to the suffusing irony of this film and to the event we're having right now. Netflix uses the same homophily algorithms to recommend films to me, and I'm equally dependent on the Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook platforms to get out the news of tonight's discussion and draw you into it. During this time of necessary physical isolation, how can we fix our now completely necessary social networked prostheses? As I come towards a conclusion of this brief comment, I want to celebrate an ancient form of community questioning, art. Artist theorist Jennifer Gurdecki, for example, has recently engaged what she calls computational fables, sifting the visual tropes of all the data industries humming in our global economy and highlighting and taxonomizing their repeating patterns in an immersive video installation. It's time we look to regulating and analyzing this commerce and networks we depend on, recasting them as utilities, communication channels, with businesses using those utilities paying tax, subject to regulation. In my naivete as a citizen, this seems like an obvious step. Tonight's panel is well equipped to address such policy suggestions. If you want to see what the World Wide Web looks like, on which we rely, we usually get a visual of something like this stock photo featured in a Networked World article on low Earth orbit systems, which are recommended as a cure for the digital divide, which describes that 47% of the world's population has no internet. PBS joined this imagery in 2016 with their recent online mini documentary, ForEveryone.net, featuring some of tonight's very panelists in a defense of net neutrality and celebrating our own beloved Tim Berners-Lee. The images that filmmaker Jessica Yu chose for her documentary, ForEveryone.net, to visualize this abstract infrastructure are both themselves abstract and material, ranging from the arcing imaginaries of electromagnetic radiation on the upper left to the linked but decentralized amoeba of network diagrams below it, and occasionally focusing on the literal hardware of breadboard circuitry from a previous revolution. The influence of the film can be mapped in the very title of that industrial article I cited earlier, which is subtitled, "An Internet for Everyone, Not Yet." But as I turn to our panelists, another network is haunting the various rooms in which we sit. The network of zoonotic diseases and the human vectors that have always negotiated with these microbial fellow travelers, both old friends and new antagonists. I think there's every reason to include our coronavirus networks into a discussion of the Ethernet platforms that connect and divide us, for the underlying realities of disease and death are exacerbating every inequity baked into our flawed social systems. As we approach our discussion, I want to point to the problem in assuming that it's our personal online hygiene or the prosecution of one or two rogue agents, e.g. Snowden or Assange, that provides the answer to data privacy dilemmas. Frankly, we need regulation. Should it be like the European data laws my IT brother was briefing me about once he heard about this event? He works for a Danish company and pointedly does not participate in Facebook. Or is it too late to rein in these gigantic self-regulating juggernauts of the American economy and indeed the global economy? As he said in the end of his email to me, the toothpaste may be out of the tube. So it's time to turn to our panelists to begin debating the questions I've floated about the differences between our images and imaginaries of data magic and the actual politics of infrastructures, networked systems, monetized data commerce, human agents, state policies, and data privacy. To introduce again our esteemed panel for anyone who joined late, I'm sharing with you an average Google image harvest for Ethan Zuckerman, digital public infrastructures expert, Danny Weitzner, internet policy czar, and Patricia Williams, critical legal scholar, race theorist, and mad law professor extraordinaire. So thanks for indulging my intro. I'll turn off my slide share now and ask the moderators to begin with Ethan, whom I'm hoping can start us off on just what the magic of cinematic data effects conceals and reveals.
Well, thank you so much, Caroline. What a great way of sort of setting up these questions. I love the model that you put forward of data as environment, data as emanation, and now data as manipulation. And what I really want to think about is, who is that idea of data magic as manipulation? Who is it actually doing work for? So coming back to the Great Hack, which I watched quite closely in preparation for this event, and some of the assertions made by Professor David Carroll, he early on in the film asks us, have you ever seen an ad that's so good that you're convinced that Facebook is actually listening to you? And then the film goes on to sort of explain that with the 5,000 data points that Cambridge Analytica has captured about each and every one of us, that with sufficient data, manipulation of human emotion and preference is possible. And I think it's just worth asking really on in this whether you personally believe this to be true. So maybe the simplest way to say this is, can Facebook make you buy something that you didn't want to buy? I think most of us would say, no, they can put something in front of me that might be appealing that I didn't know about, but they're probably not actually going to change my mind or persuade me. So let's then ask the harder case. Can Facebook make you vote for someone that you don't want to vote for? So here's the thing. There's actually a lot of political science about elections and persuasion. There's a terrific paper about 2 years ago from Joshua Kalla and David Birchman. It's a meta-study of 40 different experiments in political persuasion. They look at door knocking, they look at lawn signs, they look at phone calls from friends, they look at text messages, all the different ways that we try to persuade people to get out and change their minds in an election. And what they find across these 40 studies is that the net effect of persuasion is zero, null. You can't do it. It's really hard to change people's point of view politically. And in fact, people who are deeply embedded within politics know this. What they actually focus on is not actually changing their mind. They focus on mobilization. They focus on getting people out who they feel are more likely to vote on their behalf. So the first thing that I would ask when we look at this notion of data and manipulation is, how manipulable are we really? Are we really swayed by these ads? Are we really capable of being swayed by these ads on really deep things like our political points of view? Well, maybe not you, maybe not you, maybe not me. Maybe there's a small group of people who are highly persuadable. That's the sort of weaker version of the Cambridge Analytica argument. They're really terrific at identifying that small group of people who can be swayed with just the right narrative at the right time. My simple response would be, prove it. And prove it using people who are not members of this cult of data. Because one of the people that this persuasion narrative is working for are people who make their living off of this data cult. They're either marketers selling something like Cambridge Analytica and its great genius, or they're selling the power of programmatic advertising and the ability to target this stuff. This stuff actually, a pretty good analogy for this is to think about blackjack, right? So to set this up, The average ad on the web has about a 5 in 10,000 chance of getting clicked. So for those who sort of care about the numbers, it's a 0.05% click-through rate. We're really, really good at blocking out ads out of our minds. There's all sorts of eye tracking studies that show that human beings will learn almost immediately to ignore where the ad is on the page. That rate, by the way, includes all those accidental clicks, right? So we're really good at figuring out how not to click on the ad. And that's a number from 2019 from DoubleClick. That's across the entire web. So we're not running to click on these things. But if you could get people to click just slightly more of these things, you would be a very successful ad tech company. You would be beating the spread on this. And that's the way in which this is like counting cards at blackjack. If you play blackjack over a long period of time, you're going to lose. If you can count cards perfectly and get yourself a tiny little advantage over the house, it is theoretically possible to win at blackjack by raising your percentages a tiny amount. Most of the time you're going to lose anyway. It's such a small advantage and most people aren't disciplined enough to do it. What big data is basically claiming is that they can give you the card counter's advantage. Instead of 0.05% of clicks, you might get 0.06% of clicks. And that, in the advertising business, would be enough to distinguish you way, 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 way from the mean. The question, though, is with all of that data accumulated, all of that data emanating from our heads and sort of being collected, do we actually believe that that's enough to shape our politics or sort of change things around in terms of persuasion? So for me, the really interesting question in this is, why would we believe this stuff? Why would we believe in data magic, which I'm going to argue, and I'm not alone in this, is puffery, it's hype. Most of it is horseshit. One of the reasons why we believe this is that there's an enormous industry built on it. There are hundreds of billions of dollars around ad tech, buying data, compiling it, sorting it, putting it together. And everybody in that field depends on getting that rate from 0.05 up to 0.06. And by showing us just how much data they're able to generate, they manage to convince us that data is somehow an asset like oil, rather than what it actually is most of the time, which is toxic waste. It's something that we should be disposing of very carefully, and it's actually a cost for our business more than anything else. So one reason, one way data magic does this work is in persuading us that this business is not in fact an enormous bubble. And if you want a good case for why it's a bubble, look at Tim Wong's new book called The Subprime Advertising Crisis, which basically argues this entire thing is about to pop. But I think there's a better reason and maybe a more sympathetic way of understanding why we have a tendency to believe in data magic. And it's because if Cambridge Analytica, this shadowy firm, somehow led Brits astray and led them out of the EU and somehow got America to elect Donald Trump, then we don't need to deal with the reality that somewhere between 40 and 45% of Americans think Donald Trump is doing a really good job, even now, even after 220,000 dead from COVID, a fact that suggests a radically different view of reality and real complications for democracy. If Cambridge Analytica threw our election, it means we don't have to consider the many ways in which American democracy has been systemically undermined and rigged to the point where 2 out of the 5 last elections, the party that got fewer votes was the one that won, and they ended up winning in part by suppressing votes out there. If Cambridge Analytica had won an election, then all we really need to do in all of this is somehow fix Facebook. We don't have to worry about hyperpartisanship. We don't have to worry about a news industry that has lost its business model, and to a certain extent it's rousing debt. We don't have to worry about a Congress that's become alarmingly dysfunctional. So data magic is a fantasy. And ultimately, it's a heartwarming fantasy in which some bad actors are capable of manipulating a dangerous system and briefly derailing our democracy. And the reason this fantasy is heartwarming is that the real story is so very much darker. Many aspects of contemporary democracy are badly broken and need thorough, total overhaul. The partisanship, disinfo, the manipulation that we see in this data magic fantasy is a symptom, and it's a symptom that keeps us from paying attention to the rot of our institutions that's actually underlying it. So there's my opening provocation. I look forward to a point where you ask me to be affirmative and positive and actually put a policy solution forward in all of this. But I think it's important to start by talking about the work that data magic is doing and who it's working with.
Fantastic. I'm going to throw the ball to Danny, who is a policy speaker, and see if he can tell us what we should really be afraid of and what we should ask our representatives to achieve.
Well, Caroline, thank you, and I'm so pleased to be here with Ethan, who I know well, and Pat, who I'm really honored to have a chance to meet. I really appreciate, Caroline, your critical view of the aesthetics of representation of this data environment that we're in, and I agree that many of those images, I think, are meant to suggest that somehow we as individuals and communities are overwhelmed, overpowered, bewitched by these putative magical properties of data. I think Ethan has persuaded us that perhaps we should look at those claims quite critically, that the smoke and mirrors that has always been advertising has just come to the internet environment, and maybe there's not much really new. I do want to, though, zoom out a little bit and share with you some of the things that I do worry about. And this is going to be much more in the frame of the First Amendment and democracy than in the frame of privacy, because in a very real sense, when the internet was first appeared on the public scene in the 1990s, we were told it was going to revolutionize democracy. And I think people now look at it and worry that maybe it hasn't. At best, maybe it hasn't helped. At worst, maybe it's actually made things a lot worse. So I do want to share with you some of the mixed feelings that I have about this environment, about how we've created it technically, about how we've chosen to regulate it. But I guess I will, and we'll see where we come out. So I'll share some mixed feelings about social media and electoral politics, social media about mixed feelings about social media and the First Amendment doctrine, and then a little bit about the question of manipulation. You know, to be blunt, I worry that a lot of the critique of social media and democracy is highly situational and outcome oriented. If we step back to 2006, 7, 8, when the two presidential election cycles ago, what we saw was a situation and an understanding of the role of social media in democracy that was almost 180 degrees opposite of where we seem to be today. Barack Obama, then Senator Obama, was able to be viable as a candidate, as an upstart candidate, against the establishment virtual incumbent Hillary Clinton, who had much more money, much more recognition, much more status in the party. And social media played a awfully important role in his ability to, in President Obama's ability to organize new communities of supporters, to get more people involved, to mobilize, as Ethan said, and the election was transformative in that sense. I would say substantially because of the affordances of social media, and in spite of the affordances of traditional broadcast and cable TV-based advertising, which had been the core stuff of electoral politics before that. Now, though, we're faced with the outcome in Clinton versus Trump, and we all of a sudden feel that social media has deceived and manipulated us and let us down. Um, I think that we ought to ask whether that was really the crux of what we ought to be concerned about, or whether there was something else, whether there's something else perhaps deeper, darker, more fundamental going on. And now, as we're in the midst of Trump versus Biden, we have a lot of people who worry a lot about the risk of sophisticated manipulation. I think on the upside, we see actually better responses to the very real disinformation and manipulation that is going on from a number of candidates, from the platforms themselves. And I think most importantly, one of the things that we see in 2018, the 2018 elections and now, is that yet again, social media platforms are absolutely vital for the transformation of politics and for the realignment of political interest at the state and local level. What had been very strong arenas for the conservative side of politics in the US have become areas in which the progressive candidates and progressive movements have had a resurgence of political effect and power. And so I think we have to take seriously both sides of what is enabled by social media. The second anxiety I want to share is a little bit more doctrinal. The traditional understanding of the First Amendment in the US has always been that it's meant to promote democratic discourse, to expand our democracy, to expand people's access to government and the political process. And for quite a long time, there was a sort of a simple framework that was applied that said there are certain media environments that have a quality of abundance, the print medium in particular, and the general regulatory approach was to leave the print medium alone and let it just act as a venue for speech, particularly political speech, without much government intrusion. By contrast, there's been a view that the broadcast media, radio and television, have been characterized by scarcity and that we need more regulation involved in order to make sure that there's a balance of voices, that all different perspectives have the ability to be represented in what are understood as inherently scarce communication channels. Now, the internet came along in the 90s and frankly was meant to fix this. And full disclosure, I worked very hard in the early and mid 90s to encourage the US Congress to number one, not censor the internet. Number two, not give the Federal Communications jurisdiction over the internet as it had over radio and television. And number three, to support the now well-known Section 230 that gives the internet platforms, the social media platforms, a very favorable regulatory environment in which to enable quite a lot of speech and not be responsible for very much of it at all. And I do worry a little bit that maybe we should rethink a little bit of that. But I think that ultimately the source of homophily, which we can regard as a political ill perhaps, is so much more on cable television than anywhere else, and has historically so much more been there. And I still do hold on to the view that the internet remains a vital environment for marginalized voices, for upstart voices, for voices that are not well funded. So though we perhaps had an overly rosy view of what the internet could do if left in an only lightly regulated environment, I'm not sure that how many of the problems we fix by creating a more regulated environment. Now, the final thing I'll say is that has nothing to do with privacy. I think that the question of how we ought to regulate the use of personal information is really a question of what rights, what individual rights and what collective rights we desperately need to be recognizing. I don't, I'm with Ethan, I don't worry that much about the manipulative effect of large scale targeting and profiling that is done through the abuse of people's privacy rights. But I do worry about the very real risk that people's behavior and people's political activities can be chilled if they feel they're being tracked and they're being watched and they're being profiled. And I would, final thing I would say is that I'll leave everyone with one, I think, shining example of forward-thinking privacy approach from in the United States. In the 1950s, many Southern states that were attempting to suppress civil rights protests attempted to collect large amounts of personal information from the members of groups like the NAACP and other civil rights organizations. And the Supreme Court, on First Amendment grounds, not on Fourth Amendment grounds, but the Supreme Court on free speech grounds said that many of those regulations were unconstitutional because they were intended to suppress people's political expression and intended to suppress people's freedom of association. So no doubt there are serious questions in the regulation of commercial use of personal data. I think we should pay a lot of attention also to what's happening in the way that surveillance and profiling can end up suppressing political speech. And I'll leave it at that.
Wow, there's a ton to think about there. Pat is in an undisclosed location with tender internet that cannot be predicted, so she doesn't get to be part of our Tron universe over here. And it's hard for her to see the chat. So Pat, the questions coming to you are, was Obama the first Facebook president and now we have the first Twitter president? Are these media enfranchising or disenfranchising? In other words, can you help us direct the anxieties that Americans have about how these social media are influencing, the viability of our voting process and of our democracy? I mean, this is pretty big stuff. So handing all that to you. You are muted. Let's see if our wizards can unmute you.
Yes, thank you.
There you go.
No, I think anxiety is exactly the right word. I am anxious. We are all anxious. And I foreground that because as a lawyer, I join in this desire for some form of regulation. And the problem of regulating data is that it is precisely so shape-shifting. 1 minute it's our property and we're talking about contract, and maybe it's privacy and tort, or maybe it's human rights in terms of human dignity, and maybe it should be criminalized as harassment or should come under civil rights laws. And that shape-shifting, I think, is a tribute to data's power to escape regulation. So if you don't mind, I'm going to sidestep the question of regulation. As a lawyer, I feel like I've been in endless debates over the years about what it is that we can regulate or not. And it's almost amorphous in its ability to escape that kind of regulatory confinement. And so it seems to me that part of what is going on is that, data and its impact is so affective. And it's persuasive because it's not just about ideas. It's not just the content of an advertisement. It's about synesthesia. It is about an aesthetic, and it's an aesthetic of surveillance, I think, as others have pointed out. Because we're not just swayed by the advertising or the market potential or who's friended or not friended us. We're going on as a dynamic of what we think other people are thinking of us. And we don't want to be marked as left out. We don't want to be just stereotyped as algorithms do. They categorize us, they assort us. I think of assortment as another form of stereotype. And in that sense, it's a power like being raced. And if you think of race as a kind of genre making, it is, you know, we are being re-raced in constant new configurations that are not simply about phenotype anymore, but about every habit or, you know, it's that surveillance trail we leave. But in that sense, if you put it against that sort of, you know, social psychological backdrop, it's like Jane Elliott's blue-eyed, brown-eyed power of persuasion, or Lord of the Flies. It's a market model based on who's in and who's out, and the urge to align oneself with the right kind of people, even if that right kind of people is shifting constantly in this new universe. And in politics, in its most primitive and yet simultaneously its most sophisticated sense. And so I keep thinking about this a little bit outside just being a lawyer at this moment, if you'll bear with me for just one moment. Because when I was in high school, many decades ago, we had something back then that we called Facebook. And it was a big notebook made of paper with 2 cardboard covers. And where I went to school, there was a very skilled cohort of mean girls. And so every year, at the beginning of the year, the social hierarchy would be set by that book, that Facebook version 0, pre-pro, with a mega memory capacity of 50 loose leaf pages. And it would be secretively handed from person to person up and down the aisles during Latin class. And what was inside? On each page, someone's name was written at the top of the page, and underneath, people would enter anonymous opinions about that person. And the opinions were creative and detailed. And because they were anonymous, they were cruel. They were exceptionally cruel. And if, as so often happened to me, that book was handed over your head, if it bypassed you, if your access was denied, so to speak, then you knew that what was being said about you was too terrible even to share. You knew that you had been terminally unfriended, although that wasn't the term we used in those days. So flash forward to the present. And I don't know whether Mark Zuckerberg got the name Facebook from that primitive format, but I'm old enough to remember when that's what Facebook commonly meant. Indeed, there are stories, perhaps apocryphal, about how Zuckerberg's first version of the app was about ranking hot women. But in my mind, today's billion-dollar version of Facebook remains a sophomoric instrument of revenge. Hard copy Facebook, amplify and manipulate the teenage desire to be liked, the nerd's anxiety of missing out, the threat of being excluded from the room of many likes. And the architecture of this technology is surely also about a really evil business model. But it's also a psychic trap, and that's what I think makes it so hard. It's a psychic trap on steroids. Social media appeals to human loneliness. It cultivates loneliness. We connect in and through our isolation. Algorithmic networks are powerful, but oxymoronic, plural, but solitary, intimate, but remote, social, yet antisocial. And so they exist, especially now, enclosed in their numbers. Our bodies conveyed like tile renderings or as tile renderings, trapped as though in a cult by the rules of others' opinions of us and their ability to assort us. In the Netflix film, which you pointed out at the beginning, Caroline, The Social Dilemma, and which I saw just a few hours ago, Cathy O'Neil, who is the author of Weapons of Mass Destruction, is quoted as saying, "Algorithms are opinions embedded in code, then optimized to some definition of success." And so we live in a world where the equivalent of trillions of cyber mean girls' opinions have been encoded and let loose, hooked up with advertisers and monopolized commercial interests and extreme ideologues and professional manipulators and outright pornographers and warmongers. So then this whole model has been allowed to drill into our brains, take over our thoughts, addict us to riding the wave of constant consuming instantaneous information till we are so consumed that we are starved in every other realm of existence. We don't eat, don't sleep. And this merging with a quantitative composite of ourselves has taken over the space within ourselves. where our most healing sensations of humanity used to reside. It has entered and occupied the generative domain of trance, ritual, calm, daydream, and peace. It has subverted the exclusivities of both private ownership and public domain, and unconstituted the constitutiveness that we call the Constitution. Everything comes to us from an outside that somehow feels internal to ourselves and that defines us, leads us in this so-called attention distraction extraction model. Now, to get back to the lawyerly, politically concerned person of myself, perhaps I wonder, and I sort of really throw this out as a question, if some of this is a global upsurge in ultra-libertarianism. Yes, I know libertarianism is a driver of the profit motive upon which tech markets feed. And yes, that's built into the machine. But it's also a reaction to the emotional state of the architects, the human programmers. We all end up pushed to struggle for, yearn for, to defend the integrity of an identity rooted in not being the other. It's what I think of, and if I'm wrong, I hope I can be corrected, but I think I associate with what Sherry Turkle describes as a form of narcissism built into this machine. Such an emotional state gives great deference to what seems subjectively reasonable, rather than to what's independently offline or externally tested or reliably replicated as a matter of science or slowed down the sequences of due process. What's reasonable. Being in this kind of brain state cedes no legitimacy to collective governance. In other words, if individual subjectivity or narcissism is the only measure, there's a disconnect between sovereignty and governmentalism. And there goes democracy. Algorithmic assortments on social media, they work their magic to modify community space into a patchwork of individual principalities, each its own tense little war zone, its own guarded turf, subject to eruption without warning. And these projections of freedom as ultimate control are accompanied by a form of subjectivity fantasized as immune, sovereignly immune to consequence, because it is defined as inherently ungovernable. And this extreme form of libertarianism, or narcissism, rationalizes itself, the one and only self, as resolutely and staring down webs of life, viral life, in our present pandemic, in which we are all invisibly and irretrievably enmeshed, both institutionally and biologically. And the exercise of this form of ungoverned, self-declared sovereignty undermines anything like, again, democracy, federalism, representative government, unity of states. Power from the top is almost gaseous, suggested but not coordinated, envisioned but not visible, insinuated but rarely stated. And as a result, no single person or institution can easily be brought to account. Philosopher Paul Virilio wrote that increasingly we exist in a closed circuit of perfect synchronization. We are all everywhere in the world, simultaneously, at high speed, yet encased in a split second. And he says that that kind of perfect synchrony is the same thing as immobility. And I find this really conceptually tantalizing. Global segmentation within a comprehensive unity. It leads to what Michel Foucault wrote of times like this, a claustrophobic panic that leads to an entire culture of panic. And Virilio goes on to speak of what Durkheim called the suicidal state. The anguish of permanent stress makes the acceptance of death feasible and even more desirable than living that life. And I think of that when I hear Glenn Beck and lots of people in this political environment say, even if we all get sick, I would rather die than kill the country. And this strikes me as being cultic, a little like Jonestown. There's something lemming-like and suicidally ideated about it. And it also concerns we the people, but offers a kind of self-sacrifice, again, for a golem, which is external and over there, but for which we could just lay down our lives because we're tired. But this is not the country as we the people. Recently, essayist Sabrina Ora-Mark wrote a piece in the Paris Review entitled, "I'm So Tired." And she writes about her family's anxiety about her sister, who was at the time of that writing, quite ill. And her very sad mother says, "I need somewhere to go." And Mark writes, "What I don't tell my mother is that we have already gone somewhere. We are already in this place where the world we once knew is rushing out of us." And these words have really stayed with me. If there's any consistency to what I think perhaps we are all feeling at this moment, it is captured by the paragraph, affecting particularity in that vision of the external world, not just changing around us, but of interior worlds being sucked and rushing out of us. And I'll stop there.
Pat, thank you. That was incredibly powerful and frustrating because your internet was doing a little bit of a
Oh no.
a slow waltz with your words. I think we heard most of them, but I'm going to just throw out a few gems in that beautiful literary crafted response note and, see if Danny and Ethan want to respond. So Facebook, a sophomoric infrastructure of revenge. The threat of ultra-libertarianism, which is certainly a characteristic of certain tech, cultures. The connection of libertarianism with a kind of narcissism, which then segues into a Durkheimian suicidal ideation of kind of giving up because we the people is so hard. Is that
That's
a certain kind of arc that was going on there?
yeah, I couldn't have said it better myself.
So the place of regulation, which you thoughtfully deferred, that would be hard to get out of that intensely psychological matrix that you wove for us there. But maybe, I don't know, Ethan or Danny, does one of you want to take on that beautiful tangle?
Well, let me say, Pat, actually, I think the slowing of your voice added a certain digital aesthetic to it that was actually quite beautiful, as well as your background. It was this it was this ghost in the machine offering us this sort of wise perspective on all of this.
It's growing dark here. It's grown very dark since I began. Sorry.
No. I think your aesthetic choices are magnificent, up to the low bandwidth. So I was really struck by some of the phrases that you put forward. Particularly this sort of idea that social media appeals to human loneliness, and this notion that in part through these algorithms, through getting surrounded in our own echo chambers, we find ourselves in these sort of guarded territories. I am less interested in solving Facebook's problems for them by regulating them or sort of telling them how to regulate themselves. What I'm really interested in is whether some of what you're observing, Pat, about the psychic effects of social media are particular to a particular way of building social media, what I might call Facebook's logic, right? So Facebook's logic is we have a single site. It does one thing for 3 billion people. They all use it in the same way. It has the same front door for all of them. They have no role in governing it. It's largely opaque in sort of how it works for them. It's free in the sense that it doesn't cost you any money, but you pay with your information. And the ultimate goal of this is not the advancement of humanity or the betterment of society. It is to make money for stockholders and ultimately for the venture-backed investors. And I think in many ways we tend to assume that that logic, that sort of set of characteristics together, describes all of social media. And fortunately, it doesn't, right? There's other types of social media out there. They actually operate on very different logics. You have everything from a Reddit, which has its own horrors in some ways, but has some terrific community governance associated with it. You have wonderful phenomena like the women, for the most part, who've built the world of fan fiction, who've sort of created their own platforms that function much more like a collective. And I wonder whether the response to this world of data magic and surveillance isn't one that sort of demands that we imagine better. So a lot of the work that I'm doing right now basically says, what if we imagine social media spaces that instead of being toxic for us, were affirmatively designed to try to make us better citizens and better neighbors? What if they were small and plentiful and you joined into them for very specific purposes? And part of joining was not just to reaffirm your identity or to hear the familiar, but to actually be involved with the governance of them so that we're participating in this sort of small d democracy of building and shaping out these spaces. So, Caroline, I want to suggest that there's multiple ways to try to deal with the world of manipulation evoked by data magic. One is to try to regulate it out of existence, and you can understand being scared by these horror films, why you might want to do that. But I want to suggest that actually the braver response is not just to regulate your way out of the hole, but is actually to imagine and start inventing social media that isn't necessarily preying on the mean girl and all of us passing the notebook back and forth in Pat's school.
Danny, you're still muted, so let's get you live.
There we are. Pat, I think you left us with this wonderful question about our whole age, not just our media environment, which is this question in my mind about what is this connection between libertarian politics and arguably libertarian technology design and narcissism. And it feels to me as if in many ways all the work that Ethan is talking about doing in designing different kinds of media environments are about moving the information interaction architecture that we have from one that encourages, what was your phrase, the Foucault's claustrophobic panic, which is a very kind of sad and poignant characterization perhaps of the way that people whose lives are a little too wrapped up in social media feel and are damaged by, but that it seems to me that all of our politics and all of our culture and our educational institutions and everything else are ultimately about finding a way out of that libertarian narcissistic trap that we're in for a lot of reasons. And I think it certainly is the case that many of the media environments, whether it's cable television or the internet or the web or anything else, reflect a certain kind of libertarian narcissist design. But I also think there's a ongoing resistance to that design, both in redesigning those environments or creating new environments, as Ethan said, but also just in the way that people behave in these environments. And I come back again to my sort of quixotic view of what the Obama election in 2008 was about. It was about connecting with people. It was about the antithesis of narcissism. And we might like to, depending our political persuasion, we might like to say, well, and therefore the Trump environment was the opposite of that. It was all narcissistic. I don't know, maybe not. I think there was a fair amount of connection that happened, perhaps a little bit more at a mass scale. And to me, this is first and foremost, a social and cultural and artistic challenge. The regulatory part of this challenge, I think, has to do with making sure that individuals that want to both understand the data environment that they're in and have some flexibility in it, have the ability to do that. I don't think I really look to any of our regulatory environments to fix these problems. I do think I look to our regulatory environments to make sure that they are fixable by people who want to fix them, because I think it ultimately, we got to a lot of the dysfunction of mass media, I think, long before the internet with radio and television. We got to it because of regulatory limitations, as well as a number of market limitations and other things. And I think we saw in radio and television the limited ability that regulation had to produce the kind of democratic communications environments we want. I think I still hold out a lot of hope that the inherent malleability of the internet environment creates a lot of space for creativity and transformation and resistance. And I think our challenge on the policy side is to make sure that that can happen.
Do you want me to say something, or can
Sure.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I certainly in my talk, I was specifically referring to the architecture as it's presently constructed.
Yep.
There's no reason it has to be that way. And so that's why I start with it, that it is this is creating that anxiety of which I speak. It's set it up. And, you know, there is no reason it has to be that way. You're absolutely right. That don't mean to insinuate that this is a problem of technology. It's just that technology has consumed so much of our lives. But this sense of both isolation and enmity draws on historical traumas, historical divisions. I mean, it expresses itself reiteratively from things that have nothing to do with technology. But I do think that I'm not, you know, I do think that we need to pin it down, because I haven't given up on regulation at all. I just wanted to point out the degree to which our failure to regulate is driven by this kind of affective response to it, and this inability to visualize it or to create what Carol and I imagine would call the sort of narrative structure to be able to say these are our limits. But you know, but the reason we are in such trouble with other forms of media, from broadsheets to which is an entertainment organ not under the ethics of traditional media, was that we allowed monopolies to come. We did away with the fairness doctrine. We specifically made mergers that affected the independence of that media, and had it overseen by basically militarized forms of or weaponized forms of manipulation rather than regulation. So, you know, I think that regulation can work. It may not be perfect, but it's, you know, some form of regulation could do better than what we're seeing now. And so I don't mean to throw in the towel. I just mean to underscore the degree to which it's slippery, because we have embedded it in language that we don't associate with what's regulated. We can embody it. We can give it meaning in a way that fits under the language of harassment, or, you know, it isn't like we are helpless. We had at any rate a set of constructs that talked about the evils of monopoly power. We can reinvigorate that as part of the discourse.
Yeah, let's hope we get back to that. I'm going to start. There are a lot of questions out there, so I'm going to start adding them to the discussion. And one of them, you know, is very pointed and very recent. In the context of surveillance, we also have law enforcement, and we know a lot about how media has transformed some of the ways that that has been perceived and experienced by a wider population. But the question is, any ideas about the increase of social networks connecting harmful motives with decided actions for terrorism? And the questioner is thinking in particular about the Michigan kidnap plot, or the killing of the French teacher. So on the one hand, a certain amount of surveillance is necessary to determine that these plots exist, right? On the other, right, there's this claustrophobic panic, and Danny's worried about people feeling intimidated about what they're plotting. Anyway, the question is about some of these extremely scary events that are happening in reality that seem to have very strong enabling circuitry in the social media, various social media.
So I think we should stipulate one thing about the way that most investigations of serious crime, of terrorism, of large-scale organized crime, of almost any crime you can think of, still the investigations turn on what are often human sources and the ability of law enforcement to infiltrate far enough into organizations, whether they're perpetrating violent extremism or sexual abuse or human trafficking or anything else. I will say that I once was in a supremely odd situation when I was in the middle of fighting against a number of surveillance proposals from the FBI in the US Congress, and got a call from a very senior FBI official who told me that there was some proposal about trying to segregate chat rooms into kids and adults. And this was supposed to protect kids. And this FBI agent said to me, "You have to stop them." I said, "I have to stop them?" And the reason was because FBI investigators then and now depended on being able to be present in those chat rooms to impersonate both victims or perpetrators in order to understand where the crime was happening. Now, sometimes this happens with very abusive political motives, and we have to always watch out for that. But I don't think we're solving any crime anytime soon by advanced artificial intelligence. We are mostly solving crime with old-fashioned tools. And I think, and what that means is that we have to make sure we have old-fashioned legal tools to assure that law enforcement that do that kind of infiltration and surveillance do it in a way that's accountable to judicial supervision. The degree of judicial supervision for complicated electronic surveillance is absolutely atrocious for the most part. Courts are overwhelmed, judges are overwhelmed by complex surveillance requests, and in many, many cases are virtual rubber stamps. And I worry about that a lot. So I don't think the problem is that police somehow can't investigate crime. I think the problem is that there's a high degree of infiltration into activities that in many cases ought to be protected.
Great. Maybe now the video wizards can bring us into gallery view for the webcast questioners that are the questions are starting to come in. And following on Danny's mention of AI, that's something that MIT thinks about a lot. One questioner asks a rather poetic question. Maybe it could become part of Patricia's psychological poetics or Ethan's more democratic small group model. The question is, can the codependent relationship between social media platforms and their users be categorized as a kind of artificial intelligence? In other words, is there an aggregate here that is functioning as some sort of hive mind? I guess I would interpret this in a kind of 1990s postmodern fantasy of the internet. Ethan, do you want to take that on?
I mean, in a literal algorithmic sense, it's absolutely true, right? The way that social media works on a network like Facebook is that it uses signals from individual users to determine what others should pay attention to. So Facebook made this really critical decision 8 or 9 years ago where they decided that it was too overwhelming to see every message from all of your friends. And instead, what would happen is that they would give you this highly filtered news feed, which would be an incomplete view of your network, but it would be the things that you were most likely to care about. What this meant was that there are friends who continue to post that you probably never hear from. It may never make it into your feed. There are pieces of information because they're promoted that do sort of make it into your feed. But for the most part, the feed, we believe, is sort of looking for signals from you. So if you engage with a piece of content on Facebook, if you like something, if you comment on it in particular, you are likely to get more comments on it. Facebook believes that if you participate in a conversation, you probably want to participate in that conversation from now until the end of time. This is actually very powerful. It's a pretty good way of determining in a whole universe of content what content is engaging. It's basically a classifier. If people engage with it, it's probably engaging. Let's share it further on. The problem with this is it's a fairly simple model, and it has been designed sort of to amplify a particular thing, something that encourages people to engage with it. Not everything that's important is something we want to engage with. And many forms of engagement are probably not particularly healthy for us. Often we're engaging with something which makes us angry, which provokes very strong emotion. Facebook has found that its own algorithm is in fact so emotional, they've stopped using it for internal discussions. So there's an internal Facebook where Facebook people talk to each other about Facebook issues, and it uses the Facebook algorithms. But what they found was that they had trained their own AI to amplify the angriest, the most emotional stuff, and they actually threw human moderators in it to sort of turn off the AI so that they could get a healthier conversation. So absolutely, I think we are very much part of the AI that is a social network. I also think that AI is quite primitive. I think it's easily hacked and manipulated. And I think its sheer opacity and our inability to interrogate it directly so that we have to have sort of folk theories about it, I think these are part of the problems of what's wrong with contemporary social networks.
Does anyone else want to comment about the hive mind?
Yeah, I mean, it's the question of criminal justice is something I absolutely agree. It requires much more human investment in investigation. That's what we need. The problem of algorithms, however, precedes, the expression of wanting to kidnap the governor of Governor Weitzner. The question for me is, why do you have all these people so enraged that they're bringing long arms and machine guns over mask wearing? That's the component that makes this, the dimension of the emotional algorithm and the anxiety to which I refer. Why the film The Social Dilemma raised that issue. How are we so directed that we are nevertheless increasingly relying on algorithmic formulations that drive us down these crazy blind alleys because we can see nothing else but pizza and the oppression of masks? But we are also, but we're also using that same technology, to grant people to decide who, as Virginia UMass talks about it in her book, Automated Inequality, we're actually using them to make decisions that human beings used to make. And so the substitution of that means that each of us has to work through our, numerical exoskeleton of data, that we are speaking not just on behalf of ourselves, but on behalf of all. And cutting through that is why I keep analogizing it to racial stereotype. People don't see me, they see the phenotype, they see the algorithmic exoskeleton of who I have most recently associated with, and parole will be granted on that. The likelihood of recidivism will be decided by that. But the actual human effort of relating to somebody is greatly diminished by this. And that's before we get to the question of the surveillance, the ubiquitous surveillance, not just by police, but by the platforms themselves, as quite chilling, as a norming mechanism.
Could I just say, to follow up on Pat's point, that if we're not careful, we're going to be in a mode where the individualized treatment, which the law is meant to guarantee, which we value in society in many different ways, that will become a luxury, not a right. Mm-hmm. It costs more money to treat people as individuals. It takes more resources. It takes longer, at least in the short run. It probably costs more money not to treat people as individuals, but that's a more complicated question. But in all seriousness, you can look at the difference between these the use of these various recidivism prediction algorithms in the federal judicial system versus state and local judicial systems. And Pat knows this well, I'm sure, that it is in the state and local systems where there's this growing reliance on these scoring systems to predict recidivism or suggest sentencing or whatever it is, because those judicial systems have been deprived of adequate resources to make genuine individual determinations about what is the right way to treat someone who has been incarcerated or been convicted or whatever state in the process they are. In the federal judicial system, where there are comparatively more resources, and also, by the way, not elected judges, there is an entirely different way of using those kinds of predictive algorithms. They're still used by the social workers and parole officers in the pretrial sentencing units of federal courts. But interestingly enough, they are used only to make a report to the judge who ultimately has to make the sentencing or parole or bail or other decision. And in fact, the decision maker in the federal system is not shown the raw score. They simply don't have access to it, because the federal judicial system regards that as too simplistic and misleading a piece of information to be ultimately useful to the decision maker. It may be important to consider along the way, and it is, but it's not the basis of a decision. And that is a function of partly, well, there's probably a lot of political reasons why for that difference, a lot of policy choices behind that difference, but there's also a raw economic reality behind that choice, which is that we don't adequately resource most of our criminal justice system, even if it wanted to be fair.
We've disinvested tremendously, and what you're pointing to is also a fundamental temporal reordering of justice itself at those levels. Because while policing does have notions like probable cause, it then is brought to court to be tested and tried as a case of controversy, which looks at what has actually happened. So it's a backward-looking gaze. when you introduce an algorithm, particularly in the situations just listed, it really is forward-looking, and that's, you know, it's forward-looking about what could happen, what will happen in the future, and that really is to what the criminal justice system is about. And when you do that, you remodel the criminal justice system to become more of a defense organization, basically. That's what spy agencies do. They look in the future. They look to the future for what might happen, and they guard the borders. But for cases and controversies for individuals, it is not supposed to be a probability of what may happen. It is a judgment based on what has happened.
Yeah, that's very helpful. I want to bring us back to what some of the questioners are interested in. They're still back with the, Facebook conversation. So the question was that, these seem to be sometimes parallel realities. And that is, in my ignorance of the technical algorithm, that is a product of the homophily algorithm, where if you like this, you'll like that. And I just ask for the panelists to comment about some of these choices. Are the choices already inherently market driven? Because someone like Wendy Chun has thought about heterophily and has tried to actually write those algorithms. An artist that I know did a hack on his algorithm for Amazon so that he got random items sent to him, confusing entirely the algorithms of marketing and purchasing. So I don't know, maybe Ethan, you want to talk about heterophily as opposed to homophily, when the questioner was concerned about these different populations that seem to live in separate realities.
So my friend Eli Pariser made a lot of noise about this idea of the filter bubble. And the filter bubble was an update of the notion of an echo chamber. The idea that if you are surrounded by people who share the same ideological stance that you do, you're likely to get more extreme in the stance that you hold. And what Pariser sort of theorized was that these algorithms that we've been talking about that give you content that you want to see are unlikely to challenge you with unfamiliar opinions. And his theory is that the customization of everything from Google search results to your Facebook feed is making us more partisan and ultimately less civic and less governable. It's an idea that caught on very, very well. It's not as supported by evidence as we might hope for. In particular, Google actually doesn't do very much personalization in their search at all. I wrote a book that came out a little bit after that Eli's did, sort of arguing that the truth is homophily, our tendency to flock with birds of a feather, is probably much stronger than the algorithm is, right? The way that you get homophily is from the friends you've chosen, and the friends you've chosen has a lot to do with who you've been introduced to and who you've grown up with and where you've gone to school and all of those different things, more than any sort of technical algorithm within them. There are definitely attempts that people have tried at heterophily. I think in many cases they're a bit heavy-handed, right? So I've seen lots of people sort of try to say, well, you lean to the left, we'll give you all news from the right. The problem is it's very easy to sort of look at that and say, well, now I know what the enemy is saying. The genuine connection comes from having something in common, having some sort of shared mission, have some sort of goal that you're working on. So the sorts of networks that I'm thinking about might well experiment with these things. You could imagine designing a social network with an explicit civic goal of introducing you to your neighbors, even if they share different politics from you. You could imagine going further and having some sort of structured encounter with someone with whom you likely have a significant difference of opinion. It's probably not best done in a social network that just says, let's throw the two of you together and see what sort of sparks fly. But I do feel like it's the sort of thing that it's certainly worth asking the question, to what extent are these networks already designed for homophily, and could we design them to counter homophily? But I think in a funny way, I think the question is, as I understood it, sort of is pushing something else that I think is pretty fascinating, which is that one of the reasons that American politics seems so challenging right now is that it can seem like there's literally different universes of facts between people who hold different ideologies. Um, I wrote last year about this idea that what's happening with QAnon, which has become more visible, is the construction of an alternate reality that shares some common touch points, but it is fundamentally just a different view of the world than the reality that most of us end up sort of living in. I do think digital tools are accelerating this. I think it makes it easier to sort of find that alternate reality. But I would point out that the sort of hyperpolarization that we've been experiencing in the US is much likely more a product of cable news. That's actually where you see polarization start pulling America apart. There was a great story in The Guardian this morning that looked at not only Ardern's victory in New Zealand, but the fact that New Zealanders have had incredible confidence in their government really over the last 20 years, which is not something we enjoy in the United States. And in fact, we don't enjoy it in most advanced democracies. The speculation the author made was that New Zealand doesn't have a Murdoch television station or newspaper. So this whole narrative of don't trust the government can do nothing right, and there's a deep state cabal that actually runs everything, that's largely missing from the New Zealand media landscape. And maybe that's actually leading to a much healthier form of democracy. I think that cleavage between we have institutions and they're struggling and need reform, and the government can do nothing, and in fact, they're probably protecting the satanic pedophiles, that's a really difficult cleavage to navigate. And while I think we can trace it back to the rise of Fox News, there's no doubt in my mind that it's absolutely being aggravated by the ability of anyone to sort of advance those narratives and explore them these days.
Could I just say really quickly that perhaps, as you suggested, cause and effect is always complicated here, and perhaps we have homophily in social networks because it's the way people construct their social networks. In the same way, perhaps New Zealand has no Fox News because its politics are not suited to Fox News. So I'm actually more prepared to believe that than the other way around. It's hard to run a natural experiment there, but
you know, Danny, while you're there and while I still have internet, because I lost it for a minute, one of the questions quite interesting to me is what about Facebook beyond American sovereignty? So this connects directly with the New Zealand example. In other words, our platforms are not immune to the countries they're in, and in fact are negotiating very carefully with different kinds of, you know, framings. And I just wonder if you have any thoughts for this questioner.
well, I mean, there's no question that Facebook, Google, Twitter, Amazon, all of these platforms, which are US based, certainly in many ways would like to think of themselves as global supranational entities, have been disciplined, and they function in countries which have laws. They make money in those countries, and very simply put, by virtue of the fact that they make money in those countries, they have to follow the laws. You know, Europe is in the process of trying to realign the a lot of these questions that we've been talking about through the mechanism of the GDPR. I'm not sure how far they'll succeed. China, at the same time, is just starting from a whole different place. And so, you know, when I think about the global landscape, I kind of think about it in at least 3 big parts and then a lot of littler parts. Um, I think that, you know, what's complicated is you look at these companies partly as tech companies and partly as media companies. The extent to which they are media companies, they clearly have to live in the national regulatory environments that they project information into. You know, the GDPR is in the process of forcing a renegotiation of a lot of the advertising infrastructure, the advertising business models that have driven Facebook and all these other platforms. So I think there will be some adjustment from as a result of regulation, but I don't think there'll be transformation as a result of any of this regulation. Because I think the platforms look how they look, and they have the kind of basic internal logic and design that they have. I think it's absolutely right that those companies should be subject to the laws of the jurisdictions where they work, and because those laws have to protect their citizens. But I think there's an expectation that somehow different privacy regulation, for example, will upend these platforms, and I don't think it will. I think what is much more going to upend the nature of the online experience is totally new models, some of which will come from China and some of which will come from, you know, other places. So I wouldn't, I think it's absolutely the right and the duty of countries to protect their citizens, in whatever way democratic countries, in whatever way they think they need to. But I don't think they're going to turn any of these environments 180 degrees around.
So I just want to confirm for the listeners that this acronym that you threw out, GD.
Oh, so I'm sorry.
That's okay.
Terrible.
It's like General Data Protection Plan of
Regulation.
Europe.
Yes, it's Europe's now not so new comprehensive privacy protection law, the General Data Protection Regulation. It's a very strong set of privacy laws, and what's important from a global perspective is that no matter where a company or a platform is located, whether inside Europe or outside Europe, the GDPR controls what can be done with European citizens' data.
Right, and that was the little summary that I gave at the end of my talk. Just right, yeah. If anybody wants it, just email me. I'll give you my brother's point of view. And here, just for the Massachusetts voters among us, I want to ask you a very confusing question. Should we share our car? Should we want our car data to be shared with small businessmen who might want to repair it? Or should we allow only Toyota to own our car's data? Right? This is a question on the Massachusetts ballot. And I myself, with all of my interest in these questions, was completely confused about which was the better economic and friendly community decision.
So I'm really interested in what Ethan and Pat have to say about this, but my general view is that the right to repair things that you spend lots of money on is an important consumer right. And I don't think we need more market concentration in the automobile industry. I think it's a great thing just for the average driver that you can take your car today to any number of service stations and have it fixed, or you can go to AutoZone and buy the parts and fix fix the car yourself if you're so inclined. I think that the other direction, in the end, ironically enough, will just invite a huge amount more regulation. It'll invite, it'll mean that federal regulators will have to get more and more and more involved in the way that these increasingly complex ecosystems that are used to be called cars, that are now, you know, computers on wheels, connected computers on wheels. I think we should try to keep it simple, and I think we should make sure that, you know, it's like if you bought a house and you couldn't replace the dishwasher without, or you couldn't even fix the dishwasher without going and finding the person who built the house and said, do I have permission to figure out what's wrong with my dishwasher? It's kind of crazy.
Great. Thank you for that very, you know, pointed answer to my very specific question. I'm going to turn a few questions over to Pat, because Ethan kind of answered these, but the audience still has this question: why do we want the magic of data? Right? Ethan had an answer, which was, we want it because it gives us an easy answer to our social problems, right? We can blame the harvesters of our data. We can blame the magicians who, you know, put it on WikiLeaks. We can blame, you know, Hillary's emails that were hacked. You know, we can blame someone for this data universe. But Pat, given your comments, which were so sort of deliciously psychological, I wonder if you have other thoughts about why people want to believe in the magic of data. I mean, for one thing, I would suggest, and maybe you can riff on this, people have a fantasy that data is objective, right? You know, the NPR guy, you know, your brain, you know, he always is like, I'm going to tell you what you really, you know, how you're really making up your mind, because I have data from psychological experiments.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think people, if I understand your question, I mean, why are people attracted or believe in data magic? Is that what you're saying? What is the magic behind it?
Right. So on the one hand, we have the films that we were talking about, which is, you know, be scared, be really, really scared, because you're like a meat machine, you know, and you're fueling this giant matrix of, you know, a reality made out of code that isn't human, that isn't organic, right? But on the good side, it's like your data will help spot COVID in your neighborhood. You know, your data will tell us, because you have a network thermometer, it will tell us when temperatures are going up in Cambridge, and you'll know that you've got a second spike of COVID coming. So there's a belief in the magic of data that subtends both the cinema and the world.
Magical. I mean, I'm not a Luddite. I love this technology. I wouldn't want to be without my computer. I really love what it does, or what it can do. But I also am very concerned about what else it can do, and what it, and really at the loss of what it could be. So that's how I would answer that question. But it's enchanting. Of course, it's enchanting. But you know, I think one of the deficits in it is precisely how the question gets framed. Well, I mean, it's very binary. I mean, it is literally binary. And so for me, part of the, you know, my relationship to it isn't just of, you know, one between homophily and heterophily. It is, you know, how can this technology be more like what I'm missing now because I'm confined and my only connection with humans is two-dimensional. You know, one of the things I'm constantly aware of missing is sitting in my local cafe and overhearing conversations, just the accident of being in the world, the unstructured nature of overhearing conversations, of running into somebody on the street, of smiling and laughing together when something silly happens in the world. That accidental connection is completely obliterated of, not all of it, but so much of what our encounter is in these sort of data manipulated environments. And it seems to me that it's not impossible to incorporate not simply, oh, we're going to force you, over with the, you know, the blue-eyed and the brown-eyed are going to sit down and talk to one another, and in these sorts of very rigid formats. But how can you replicate the easy, casual association that reinforces one's sense that the world is really a diverse and splendid place? And so that's what it's I would never say that it's less than enchanting. I'm the first one out there with but I do think that when it powers state of mind, and this is particularly forceful at a moment like this when so many of us are communicating only through
Yeah, that's exactly right. And I was
time being sorted by social data, and the consequences, begin to resemble more and more the social credit system, as some have called it. But it's an assortment that makes it very hard to escape, or that profiles you wrong. So you spend a lot of mental energy trying to, burst out of that bubble.
Yeah. I mean, and I know exactly what you mean. My 95-year-old mom was told that she was dead and that her voting record had been closed and that she, was out of luck. So it took her 6 network children, to mobilize around getting this woman her ballot by mail, because of these kind of algorithms that decided, 95-year-old is probably dead. Like that birthday passed and probably that person isn't around anymore. Anyway, there's a question here, Softy, for me, as a historian, and maybe others of you have insights here. Is there a future of kind of mining data that might be ours as historians or ours as cultural theorists? In other words, will we have access to these hordes of data? And my answer to that questioner would be probably not. In other words, I grew up with a father who was a social psychologist who knew that the best and juiciest experiments were locked into the advertising companies of America. And he would never have access to this research on impression formation, bias, stigma, right? All the things that we're now talking about were definitely something psychologists, social psychologists were interested in, after World War II, because, we'd had a disaster on our hands of, information and what it could lead people to do. So I would say that there are ways we can mine various archives in our work as historians, but we should never be naive in believing that all the data that's being harvested from us will be accessible to us in the future. I don't know if Ethan or Danny has any more informed insight on that. That's just my instinct about, and we have about 15 minutes left. So this is also a great time to deliver your summary statements.
I think you may have to direct us a little bit more than that, Caroline. Do you want to sort of ask any of us to sort of?
Well, you are aware of what data is being harvested, mined, taken, etc. Will this be any kind of a future archive? In the sense that a historian who wants to know what was going on during the pandemic of 2020 could actually, I mean, we can peer at people's Facebook pages that we're not friends with. We can, sort of sift, YouTube for some themes, right? But the historian wants there to be like a trove somewhere, the National Archive perhaps, where they could knock on the door and say, give me a slice of 2020, because I'm a historian. So I'm just riffing on this question to say probably not. We probably won't have that as a state property.
Well, let's think about a couple of things in this. I think one thing that we underestimate is just how ephemeral this world that we're living in ends up being. Twitter, to great fanfare, announced that they would be archiving their entirety and putting it in the Library of Congress until they discovered, frankly, how difficult that was. It's so much data. And then they very quietly ended the program. And in fact, we don't have a comprehensive archive of Twitter. I was involved with quite a bit of the early web in the sort of the mid 1990s. Almost none of that exists. Not only can you not see the websites that I worked on, but if I were to go back and find my sketches, I would actually have to revive hardware from the mid 1990s to sort of be able to show it. But more broadly than this, I've actually been working with a couple of researchers this summer on the question of how studyable is social media. And this turns out to be a really rough question. Twitter decided early on to charge people to do large searches against the Twitter corpus. You can spend a great deal of money to search Twitter and sort of study Twitter. Facebook, on the other hand, gives only very limited access to researchers. It has a tool called CrowdTangle that will give you some data, but not other data. And this leads to this really weird situation. The journalist Kevin Roos has been writing about the rise and popularity of far-right content on Twitter. And roughly once a week, he sort of shows off, here's what's trending on Facebook. Look at this. A lot of this is from the very far right. And Facebook at a certain point came back to him and said, no, that's not actually accurate. Yes, you're using our data, but that data doesn't actually reflect what's most popular on Facebook. We can see all the data and we can see that you're wrong, but we can't give you the data to show you that you're wrong about Facebook. Now, this is a really peculiar situation. We now have to trust Facebook that the data that they're giving us is the wrong data to understand Facebook rather than the right data, which they won't give us. And that's typical of most of these platforms. That's actually the default rather than the exception. So are we ever going to have an archive of these things? Possibly. If we had a Pompeii-like volcanic explosion that were to capture Facebook under lava, and we were able to sort of retrieve the data after the fact, it's possible that we might eventually get to look at these things. But under the contemporary models, with everything from the restrictions on privacy to just the sheer ephemerality with which we treat this, I think it's incredibly more likely that what we're going to have is actually a very limited picture of what this data environment felt like day to day, precisely because for those of us who are trying to study it on a minute level, it's incredibly challenging.
That's a great answer. I love it, partly because it reconnects to the transmedia storytelling theme. In other words, Chrissy Isles, I love this, that when she was, curating video and film and expanded cinema at the Whitney, said, I'm not really curating this content. I'm curating the machines that allow us to play the content. And then John Ippolito at the Guggenheim said, well, I'm just going to ask the artist, do you care about the machine? Or can we constantly migrate the content as information, right? And being a historian myself, interested in things like the viral video of the Deepwater Horizon leak, I know that the Wayback Machine is kind of the only way that I know how to show what was posted when, and it's very clumsy and very partial. So just a word out to all the students. If anything extraordinary happens, like take a piece of paper and write an entry. It's called a diary, and say, today the most amazing thing happened on social media, right? Because ultimately the piece of paper is a revered technology which will last longer than many of the platforms we're talking about. So I want to turn to Danny for some, maybe, a brilliant summary statement. We have a definitely a Gen Z question. How do we define privacy? Do we really need to own all our data? This is what, my kids are like. It's like, yeah, Google owns everything I do. I mean, so what?
Well,
maybe we should call this the innocent citizen fantasy. Like everything
so,
I do is fine, so why should I care?
yeah, I will say just straight out, I hate the idea of using property rights as a way to protect privacy. I think it's a disaster. I think that uh, if we tell people that the only way they can protect what we regard as, at least in some circumstances, fundamental rights is to pay for it, we really have fallen apart as a forward-thinking democracy. I think that if you look at survey data and you look at behavior of younger people, yeah, people don't care as much about who's holding their data, but they care a lot about what they're doing with the data. And in some cases, they care that it disappears. So some of the trends in what are the currently popular social media platforms have to do with at least indications, user visible indications of what the privacy circumstances are. I think that it's a weird kind of adult sort of supremacy fantasy that all the kids are stupid. I just don't buy it. And I don't think there's much evidence of it. And I think you look at the behavior of younger people who've been in the protests over the last 6 to 9 months, there's a high level of awareness of surveillance activity and those kinds of risks. And I think that will continue. And you have state legislatures all over the country that are talking about privacy legislation. So I just reject this entirely, and I don't think there's any real data to support it. I think it's like it's a panic fantasy, or like we weren't good enough parents or something fantasy that has led us to think this.
All right. Excellent. Pat, we've got like, I don't know, 4 minutes left. Do you want to lob a final thought out there?
Well, I just actually wanted to go back to the question of archive, which I think is extraordinarily interesting and important in the context of this technology. I too am working on a family archive, and it's very interesting how much it drops off with the invention of certain kinds of technology. Family films disappear, everything is online, and you can't get a V8, player for, and that's certainly going to be a problem going forward. And both Rebecca Lamoff and Jill Lepore have written really beautiful books about about certain corporate technological experiments. I think Rebecca Lamoff writes about one in the 1950s that was going to gather all the knowledge of the world and put it on data punch cards. And it sort of got forgotten and lost. And it seems to me that to some degree, we face that problem now, but it's exacerbated by the fact that this technology allows us to know everything that's going on the planet in the present tense, in this split second. And there's a way in which it obscures history to past. At the same time, and so it's a question of memorialization. Can we preserve the importance of memorialization and curating our experience, which it seems to be part of what it is to be human as well. At the same time, this is a technology that never lets us forget, but it doesn't historicize it. We're always sort of caught by the worst last moment that will live forever with us. And there is a process of forgetting that is associated with amnesty, and is with mercy in law, but in morality. And that sense of being able to let go of the past. I mean, Lewis Hyde has written a wonderful book called A Primer for Forgetting. Is that we work things through in our mourning until we're ready to let it go, and that's when we forget it. And that's part of the process of memorialization. It's foregrounding, but also letting go. This technology presents that kind of, again, I call it psychic, but it seems to me it's also a curatorial and historical challenge that allows us to mourn, that allows us to be more fully in the present than trying to spread ourselves across the global, the world in this second, then we're already behind it. We have to go and launch ourselves into the next second and leave it all behind.
Thank you. It's 7:29. So I want to thank the panelists for their endurance on Zoom. I want to thank the wranglers for the questions. I hope we got to the most significant ones. And I really, I think we're left with some very rich thoughts and wonderful, premises for going forward as citizens and as interlocutors and intellectuals. So thank you very, very much for this really inaugural event from Transmedia Storytelling Initiative at MIT and at the School of Architecture and Planning with Danny Weitzner and Ethan Zuckerman and Patricia Williams. Thank you so much for attending tonight's event.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.